March 5, 1946. The train from Washington to Fulton, Missouri, rattled through the American heartland, carrying two men whose names would define the 20th century. In the private car, Winston Churchill sat across from President Harry Truman, a glass of bourbon in one hand and a half-smoked cigar in the other. At 71, Churchill was no longer Prime Minister. The British people had voted him out in a stunning defeat just months after victory in Europe, but he remained the most recognizable statesman in the world. Truman watched as Churchill reviewed his speech notes for perhaps the 20th time that morning. The president had read the speech already, knew what Churchill intended to say, and understood that it would cause a sensation. But he also believed it needed to be said. Someone had to tell the truth about what was happening in Europe, about what Stalin was doing behind the closed borders of Soviet-occupied territory. "You're sure about this, Winston?" Truman asked, lighting his own cigar. "Once you say it, there's no taking it back. Stalin will be furious. Half of Washington will call you a warmonger. The press will have a field day." Churchill looked up from his notes, his blue eyes sharp despite the early hour and the bourbon. "Harry, I've been called worse things by better people, and as for Stalin—" He paused, taking a long draw on his cigar. "Stalin is already furious, not at what I'm about to say, but at what he knows I've discovered, that he's building a prison and he's calling it liberation." He set down his notes and leaned back, gazing out the window at the passing farmland. "Do you know when I first realized what Stalin was really doing? It wasn't at Yalta, though God knows the signs were there. It wasn't even at Potsdam, though by then it was becoming obvious. It was in October, just after the war ended." "What happened in October?" Truman asked. Churchill's face darkened. "I received a report from our intelligence services. Nothing dramatic, just a routine dispatch about Soviet activities in Poland. But one line caught my attention. Soviet authorities have closed the border between Poland and the West. No travel permitted without explicit authorization from Moscow." I read that line 3 times, Harry, and then I understood. Understood what? That Stalin wasn't liberating Eastern Europe. He was capturing it, that all the promises at Yalta about free elections and democratic governments were lies, that he intended to turn half of Europe into a Soviet colony, and he was going to seal it off from the West so we couldn't see what he was doing. Churchill stood and walked to the window, his considerable bulk moving with surprising grace. I called Anthony Eden immediately. I said, "Anthony, Stalin is building a wall, not a physical wall, but something worse. A barrier of secrecy and repression that will divide Europe in 2. And do you know what Eden said? Truman shook his head. He said, "Winston, we've just finished fighting one war. The British people don't want to hear about another one." And he was right. The people didn't want to hear it. They wanted to celebrate victory, to rebuild, to believe that peace had finally come. They didn't want to hear that our ally, the great Soviet Union that had helped us defeat Hitler, was becoming our enemy. He turned back to Truman. But it was true. And it's still true. And today, in a small college in Missouri, I'm going to say it out loud. I'm going to tell the world what Stalin is doing. And I'm going to use a phrase that's been rattling around in my head for months now. "Iron Curtain," Truman said. "Iron Curtain," Churchill confirmed, "because that's what it is. An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. Behind that curtain, Stalin is building his empire, and unless we wake up to what's happening, unless we stand together against it, he'll keep building until there's nothing left to defend." The genesis of Churchill's understanding had actually begun much earlier than October 1945. It had begun at Yalta in February 1945, when the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, had met to discuss the post-war world. Churchill had arrived at Yalta exhausted and ill, worn down by 5 years of war and the crushing responsibility of leading Britain through its darkest hour. But he was also deeply suspicious of Stalin's intentions. Throughout the conference, as Roosevelt and Stalin discussed the future of Poland, of Eastern Europe, of Germany, Churchill had watched the Soviet dictator carefully. Stalin had been charming at Yalta, reasonable, accommodating. He had agreed to free elections in Poland. He had promised to allow democratic governments in the liberated countries of Eastern Europe. He had signed the Declaration on Liberated Europe, pledging to help those countries form interim governmental authorities broadly representative of all democratic elements. But Churchill had noticed something. Whenever Stalin made these promises, his eyes had remained cold, dead, the eyes of a man who had no intention of keeping his word. After one particularly long session, Churchill had returned to his quarters and told his doctor, Lord Moran, "I don't trust Stalin. He's agreed to everything we asked for, but I don't believe a word of it. He's going to take Eastern Europe and keep it, and there's nothing we can do to stop him." "Then why did you agree to the terms?" Moran had asked. Churchill had poured himself a whiskey, his hands shaking slightly. "Because what choice do we have? The Red Army is already in Poland, in Romania, in Bulgaria. They're going to take Berlin. We can't fight them. We're exhausted, and the Americans want to go home. So we make agreements and hope that Stalin will honor them. But he won't. I know he won't." "How do you know?" Churchill had looked at Moran with an expression of infinite weariness. "Because I've been dealing with dictators for 20 years. Hitler, Mussolini, Franco. I know how they think, and Stalin is the worst of them all. At least Hitler was mad, passionate, predictable. Stalin is cold, calculating, patient. He'll smile and shake your hand and sign your agreements, and then he'll do exactly what he planned to do all along." In the months after Yalta, Churchill's fears had been confirmed with brutal efficiency. In Poland, the Soviet-backed provisional government had systematically eliminated its democratic opponents. Leaders of the Polish Home Army, the resistance fighters who had battled the Nazis, were arrested and disappeared. Elections were postponed indefinitely. Soviet troops remained in occupation, and Soviet advisors controlled every aspect of government. In Romania, King Michael was forced to appoint a communist government under Soviet pressure. In Bulgaria, a rigged referendum abolished the monarchy and established a communist state. In Hungary, Soviet troops ensured that the Communist Party gained control despite winning only 17% of the vote in supposedly free elections. And in Germany, the Soviet occupation zone was being systematically stripped of industrial equipment, which was shipped back to the Soviet Union as reparations. Millions of Germans were being expelled from their homes in the East, creating a humanitarian crisis. The Soviets were also blocking Western access to Berlin, making it clear that they intended to control the entire city despite agreements to share administration. Churchill had watched all of this with growing alarm. He had sent telegram after telegram to Truman, warning him about Soviet actions, urging him to take a firmer stance. But Truman had been cautious. The American people wanted their soldiers home. Congress was cutting military spending, and many in Washington still believed that the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union could be preserved. It was this frustration, this sense that the West was sleepwalking into disaster, that had driven Churchill to accept Truman's invitation to speak at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. It was an unlikely venue for a historic speech, but Churchill didn't care. He needed a platform, and Truman was offering him one. More importantly, Truman's presence at the speech would signal that the president agreed with Churchill's assessment, even if he couldn't say so himself. It would be Churchill's voice, but America's implicit endorsement. The gymnasium at Westminster College was packed with over 2,500 people when Churchill and Truman arrived. Reporters from around the world were present, their cameras ready. Radio networks were broadcasting live. Everyone knew that Churchill was going to say something important, though few knew exactly what. Churchill sat on the stage, waiting to be introduced, his mind drifting back over the past year. He thought about the victory celebrations in May 1945, when all of Europe had rejoiced at the defeat of Nazi Germany. He thought about the Potsdam Conference in July, where he had met Stalin for the last time as Prime Minister, and where his suspicions about Soviet intentions had hardened into certainty. He remembered a conversation at Potsdam late one evening after the formal sessions had ended. He and Stalin had been alone except for interpreters, drinking Georgian wine and discussing the future. "Tell me, Mr. Churchill," Stalin had said, his voice soft, almost gentle, "why do you distrust us so much?" Churchill had been surprised by the directness of the question. "I don't distrust the Russian people, Marshal Stalin. I distrust empires built on force and maintained by fear." Stalin had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "You British built the largest empire in history through force. You ruled over millions of people who never asked to be ruled by you. And now you lecture me about freedom. The British Empire, whatever its faults, allowed for dissent, for local governance, for eventual independence," Churchill had replied. "What you're building in Eastern Europe is different. It's total control. It's the elimination of all opposition. It's security." Stalin had interrupted, his voice suddenly hard. "The Soviet Union has been invaded twice in 30 years, Mr. Churchill. 27 million of my people died in this war alone. I will not allow that to happen again. I will not allow hostile governments on my borders. I will not allow fascism or capitalism or any other ideology that threatens us to take root in countries we liberated with our blood." "Liberated?" Churchill had said. "Is that what you call it?" Stalin had leaned forward, his eyes like chips of ice. "We call it survival, Mr. Churchill. You British have the Channel to protect you. You Americans have 2 oceans. We have only the corpses of our soldiers, stretching from Stalingrad to Berlin. Those corpses bought us the right to security, and we will have that security, whether you approve or not." Churchill had recognized in that moment that there would be no reasoning with Stalin, no compromise, no peaceful coexistence unless the West was strong enough to enforce it. Stalin saw the world in terms of power and security, and he would take whatever he could take, hold whatever he could hold. Now, sitting on the stage in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill was going to tell the world what he had learned. The introduction was gracious, laudatory, full of praise for Churchill's wartime leadership. Then he stood, walked to the podium, and looked out at the audience. He saw Truman in the front row, nodding encouragement. He saw the reporters, pens poised. He saw ordinary Americans, students and faculty and townspeople who had come to hear the great man speak. He began with pleasantries, with thanks for the invitation, with reflections on the special relationship between Britain and America. His voice was strong, his delivery confident. He was in his element. Then, about halfway through the speech, his tone changed, became more serious, more urgent. "A shadow has fallen upon the scene so lately lighted by the Allied victory," he said, his words measured, deliberate. "Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do in the immediate future, or what are the limits, if any, to their expansive and proselytizing tendencies." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he delivered the line that would define the Cold War. "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia, all these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and, in some cases, increasing measure of control from Moscow." The gymnasium was completely silent. Every person in the room understood that they were witnessing history. Churchill continued, his voice growing more passionate. "The communist parties, which were very small in all these eastern states of Europe, have been raised to preeminence and power far beyond their numbers, and are seeking everywhere to obtain totalitarian control. Police governments are prevailing in nearly every case, and so far, except in Czechoslovakia, there is no true democracy. He spoke for another 20 minutes, outlining the threat, calling for Western unity, urging the United States and Britain to stand together against Soviet expansion. He was careful to say that he did not want war, that he believed the Soviets respected strength, and that a strong Anglo-American alliance could prevent Soviet aggression without conflict. But the core message was unmistakable. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union was over. A new conflict had begun, and the West needed to wake up to the danger. In Moscow, Stalin received a transcript of Churchill's speech within hours. He read it in his office in the Kremlin, his face expressionless. Then he read it again, more slowly, marking certain passages with a pencil. When he finished, he called for Vyacheslav Molotov, his foreign minister, and Andrei Zhdanov, his chief ideologist. "Churchill has declared war on us," Stalin said flatly when they arrived. "Not military war, but ideological war. He's trying to unite the West against us, to paint us as the new enemy." "He's a warmonger," Zhdanov said. "A reactionary trying to preserve British imperialism. We should denounce him." "We will denounce him," Stalin agreed. "But we should also understand what he's doing. Churchill is clever. He knows we're consolidating our control in Eastern Europe. He knows we're not going to allow hostile governments on our borders. And he's using that to frighten the Americans, to convince them that we're a threat." Molotov spoke up. "Are we a threat, Comrade Stalin?" Stalin looked at him with something like amusement. "Of course we're a threat. We're building socialism in half of Europe. We're supporting communist parties around the world. We're challenging capitalism on every front. Of course we're a threat to them." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over Red Square. But Churchill is also right about something else. He's right that we're building what he calls an iron curtain. We are sealing off our sphere from Western influence. We are controlling our allies completely. We are creating a buffer zone that will protect us from another invasion. "Is that wrong?" Zhdanov asked. "Wrong." Stalin turned back to them. "It's necessary. The West will never accept us, never trust us, never allow us to be secure unless we're strong enough to make them. Churchill understands that. He's been fighting empires his whole life. He knows that power is the only thing that matters." He sat back down at his desk. "Draft a response. Call Churchill a warmonger, a tool of imperialism, an enemy of peace. Make it strong. But also make it clear that the Soviet Union will not be intimidated, will not retreat, will not allow the West to dictate terms to us." "And what about the Americans?" Molotov asked. Truman was at the speech. He endorsed it by his presence. Stalin nodded slowly. "Then the Americans have chosen their side. Roosevelt was willing to work with us, to compromise. Truman is different. He's listening to people like Churchill. He's preparing for confrontation." He lit his pipe, the smoke curling around his head. "Very well. If they want confrontation, they'll have it. We'll hold what we have. We'll strengthen our control. We'll support communist movements everywhere we can. And we'll build our own atomic bomb as quickly as possible, so they can't threaten us with nuclear blackmail." "You think it will come to war?" Zhdanov asked. "No," Stalin said. "Not military war. They're too exhausted, and we're too strong in Europe. But there will be another kind of war, a Cold War, fought with propaganda and espionage and proxy conflicts. Churchill has just fired the opening shot." In the weeks after the Fulton speech, reaction poured in from around the world. Many praised Churchill for his courage and clarity. Many others condemned him as a warmonger, trying to start another conflict before the last one had even ended. In Britain, the Labour government distanced itself from Churchill's speech, emphasizing that he was speaking as a private citizen, not as a representative of His Majesty's government. But privately, many British officials agreed with his assessment. In Washington, Truman faced intense criticism for appearing to endorse Churchill's message. He issued a carefully worded statement saying that he hadn't known exactly what Churchill would say, though this was a lie. But he also made clear that he agreed with the need for Western unity and vigilance. And in Moscow, Stalin gave an interview to Pravda in which he compared Churchill to Hitler, accusing him of trying to start a race war and threatening world peace. It was harsh, vitriolic, and exactly what Churchill had expected. Churchill read Stalin's response in his home at Chartwell, his country estate in Kent. He showed it to his wife, Clementine, who had been skeptical about the Fulton speech. "He's compared you to Hitler," she said, shocked. "Of course he has," Churchill replied, "because I've exposed what he's doing. I've told the world that he's building an empire based on oppression, and he can't refute it, so he attacks me personally." "Was it worth it?" Clementine asked. "The criticism, the attacks, the accusations?" Churchill was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Someone had to say it, Clemmy. Someone had to tell the truth about what's happening in Europe. I've been warning about dictators for 20 years. About Hitler, about Mussolini, and now about Stalin. Sometimes I was right and sometimes I was wrong. But I'd rather be called a warmonger for telling the truth than praised for staying silent while tyranny spreads." He walked to the window, looking out over the gardens. "Stalin is building his Iron Curtain. He's dividing Europe. He's enslaving millions of people. And if we don't stand against it, if we don't build our own strength and unity, he'll keep expanding until there's nothing left to defend." "Do you think we can stop him?" "I think we can contain him," Churchill said. "I think if we're strong, if we're united, if we're willing to stand firm, we can prevent him from expanding further. We can't liberate Eastern Europe, not without another war, which would be catastrophic. But we can protect Western Europe. We can defend democracy where it still exists. We can wait for the day when the Soviet system collapses under its own contradictions." "Will that day come?" Churchill smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "It will come, Clemmy. I may not live to see it. But it will come. Because tyranny always falls eventually. It may take decades, but it falls. And when it does, people will remember that some of us stood against it, that some of us told the truth even when it was unpopular." What Churchill said when he heard Stalin was building his own Iron Curtain was, in essence, a prophecy and a warning that would define the next 45 years of history. He said it in private conversations with Truman and Eden. Stalin is building a prison and calling it liberation. He said it in his Fulton speech. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. He said it to his wife. Someone had to tell the truth about what's happening in Europe. And he said it in his memoirs, years later. "I had seen the truth about Stalin at Yalta, but I could not stop what was coming. All I could do was warn the world." The Iron Curtain speech marked the beginning of the Cold War as a recognized reality. It gave a name and a framework to the division of Europe. It rallied the West to the need for unity and strength. And it infuriated Stalin, confirming his belief that the West would never accept Soviet security needs and that confrontation was inevitable. Churchill was right about Stalin's intentions. The Soviet dictator did seal off Eastern Europe, did eliminate democratic opposition, did build an empire based on force and fear. The Iron Curtain was real, and it would remain in place for more than 4 decades. But Churchill was also right about something else. That tyranny eventually falls. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Iron Curtain was lifted, and the countries of Eastern Europe regained their freedom. Winston Churchill did not live to see that day. He died in 1965, still in the depths of the Cold War. But his words at Fulton had helped create the Western unity and resolve that eventually won that conflict without the catastrophic war he had feared. What Churchill said when he heard Stalin was building his Iron Curtain was simple and profound. The truth, spoken clearly, at the right moment, to the right audience. And sometimes that's all history requires.